Alright, time for another DraftPhysics.com video presentation. So a brief history of the kinetic energy formula, 1/2 mv squared. It started in around 1665 with a guy called Leibniz. He was an opponent of Newton's, it turned out that way anyway, and he didn't like Newton and Descartes' physics, thought it was too atheist, didn't have enough room for God in it. He was very religious and believed in things called solitons and monads, thought we were all made of spiritual bodies of some kind. Had lots of ideas that were proven unviable, let's say. So anyway, he proposed mv squared as the definition of energy in a system instead of Newton's momentum. Newton's formula was F equals the change in your momentum over the change in time. So it could be converted into a rate, or it would be just the total force equals the total change in your momentum. And that can easily be understood as energy. So force would equal energy. And everybody believed it. Okay, so Leibniz wasn't able to sell the idea. He died in around 1700 plus. And in those ensuing 30 years, he convinced no one in England anyway, of the viability of this idea. Newton was very successful in predicting with his physics. No one saw the physics as broken. No one saw the need for mv squared. Okay, so then we jump to around 1725 or so, and we have, unfortunately, wrong page. We have Madame Châtelet, Emily de Châtelet. Okay, and she was doing a translation of Newton. She was an admirer of Newton's, but she was attracted to the philosophies of Leibniz and attempted to persuade others that there was some viability to this idea of replacing momentum with this mv squared. And so she, in attempting to understand and prove the theory or help develop it, she had contacts with other scientists who were doing experiments that would lead to that conclusion. So there were clay experiments where objects were dropped in clay at different velocities, and the penetration in the clay was different than momentum alone. Lighter objects would penetrate further in the clay. The argument could be made if they did cornstarch experiments, then the formula would be m squared v instead of the other way around. But anyway, not a very credible experiment. She also dropped things in the sand, and I've explained how those sand experiments are also deceptive. So there was pretty much quote mining of the evidence. There were no lever experiments. There were no experiments with springs or other devices that definitely would not prove this theory. And that's about it. That's all there was. Okay, there wasn't an extensive amount of experimental science done, and certainly wasn't presented evenly in the arguments. And she was convincing. She was, she had parties, she was wealthy, she could publish, and she did convince people that there was some good reason to believe mv squared was viable. And then, so we'll move on to the 1800s, and Thomas Young becomes the first person to really establish the word energy for this quality of motion thing. The idea that things have energy, or they have power, or they have substance in the very fact that they can make changes, they can cause things to happen. So we have the word energy now to describe that blanket function of being a causer of effects. And he chose kinetic energy to apply this word energy to, was the idea of kinetic, and then it got also mixed with potential energy. At the same time, there's a character called Joule who also did some experiments that just quantified, really. They didn't demonstrate anything to do with kinetic energy overtly beyond establishing that this concept of energy is a substance. That is, that you can take standard objects, make them do something, and convert all of their energy into a common substance called heat. So anything that has energy theoretically you can reduce it to this common substance of heat. And so that gets a little bit messed into the work equations and others. So it was around this same time that they applied the 1/2 to the formula, and then they started slandering Newton by saying F equals ma is Newton's formula when it wasn't. And then they used this work formula that was completely dependent on distance rather than time. So even though gravity can be demonstrated to be a time-dependent force, the longer you're in it, the more it'll affect you. That's what's happening when you're free falling, is you're being allowed to collect gravity, and you collect it based on how much mass you have. So heavy objects collect more gravity than light objects, reasonably speaking. And therefore they have more energy when they hit the ground. So that's about it. There's no good pile of evidence. There's nowhere in all the old documents where you find some decisive argument that won the day. It's all a little bit of just chicanery and nonsense and very sloppy. We've never had it proven to us that it takes 4 times more gasoline to go, twice as fast. None of the assertions come with a big volume of proof, and yet it's asserted as if it's the purest fact in the history of mankind, mv squared. So right in between, Einstein's relativity theory and quantum mechanics, you have this religious notion of squaring the velocity. And again, no good reason for doing it was seen in the 16 and 1700s until propagandists played the part of scientists and performed their racket, of persuading people rather than doing good science. So there's no good science defending it. It's never been fairly tried as an idea. It's never been put into a courtroom and the evidence has been fairly judged, whether it is at all a viable concept. And I would assert that there's absolutely no physical evidence defending it. And that's good enough reason to say, why bother including it? Why allow it to mess things up? Momentum works. Just stick with it. No reason to doubt it. Certainly there was no reason in Newton's time, and no one did. And that should be understood. Leibniz did not survive well his theories. Okay. Anyway. So longer than I wanted, but that's the way it goes. So till the next time and such, and so forth and whatnot. This has been a Draft Physics video presentation and such, and so forth and whatnot.